Okay, now we're going to get into interviewee criteria and selection. So based on the research and gap analysis that we covered in the previous section, the next question to answer is, what will your interview focus be? So depending on the size of your project, this particular focus could contain just one topic or as many as perhaps 3 topics. I don't typically recommend more than that because then you're moving from an oral history project, something that is contained and has a start and end, to an oral history program, which does not have an end date and is a much different undertaking, will require more investment, and is not the topic for today. So reining in that focus based on the gaps that you found, prioritizing from those gaps what sort of topic or topics you would like to cover. This information is what is going to help you then determine who your interviewees could be. And we do have a resource down here, one of the Oral History Association ones for it's a web guide for doing oral history. So do check out that link for some more information on this particular area. So crafting interviewee criteria. So we've got the research, we've got the gap analysis, we have then selected 1 to 3 topics that we think we may want to focus on. Based on that, what does our interviewee look like? What is the background? What sort of story can they help tell? And that is the criteria we're going to create to help us identify who these interviewees are. So for each of those topics, identify for your potential interviewees what type of criteria they need to meet. During this process, I want you to consider their age, life experiences, their position within their community, etc. And when thinking about age and life experiences, position within the community, it's not that they need to be of a particular age or have a particular set of experiences, but it's more to make sure that for the particular topic you're covering, the people you are looking for actually can speak to that topic. For example, if it's a particular historical event specific to the city that you live in, then naturally the criteria for your interviewees need to be people who lived in your city during the time of that historical event, for example. And then finally, create a selection of 3 to 5 criteria markers so that your selections can meet multiple, if not all, criteria. I do want to emphasize, while you do come up with criteria, it does not need to be a perfect fit, especially if you came up with 5 criteria, for example. If you find interviewees that are meeting like 3 out of the 5 of that criteria, that is still going to be a very valuable and worthwhile oral history interview. So don't want you to think that we need perfection here, but I do want to make sure that you have these things in mind and thought out ahead of time before you start approaching potential interviewees. That saves you time as well as saving and respecting their time. So next part to this, consider the community involved. So this is where we're going to get into some strategy around how to make sure we're not causing more harm in doing oral history work. So interview topics typically lend themselves to specific communities of people who have these shared experiences. When we identify the community group, or sometimes groups plural, present within our particular topics that we're working on, we need to consider whether or not, first of all, if we're a part of that community. As collection and memory workers, the answer typically is that we are not a part of those communities. In fact, it can sometimes be rare. And this is something to make sure that we acknowledge upfront and are aware of, because it is going to change the strategy of how we work with these communities and conduct these oral history interviews. So if you are not a part of the community or communities, plural, that you want to work with to do the oral history interviews, you need to take some additional care and thought into approaching this community. So getting into this ethics part of it, first and foremost, extractive approaches aren't ethical. Extractive approaches for our collections have historically been how our collections have formed. We know now, we know better, and so we need to do repair work, of course, on past practices, but also better work moving forward, and this is part of it. So, with that in mind, when we're approaching these communities to potentially partner with, the imbalance of power in our proposed project needs to be addressed. So, we need to remember that we are coming as representatives from an institution, and that can be quite intimidating and come with a sense of you have the higher power here to determine what happens and how. And that needs to be acknowledged and then balanced out, because quite honestly, it's the community that needs to be centered with the power and the decision making. So, the next point of this, the community will need full and well thought out project information from you in order to make a decision to participate. So, this is partly why we're going to spend so much time and thought on the intentional thought or strategies around what is it that we're doing that research and gap analysis piece, crafting then the interview criteria. You want to show them each of those pieces to show how well thought out your project proposal is thus far. And it gives them the information they need to determine whether or not they are an appropriate fit, first of all, and then second of all, whether they want to join you and help do oral history interviews. And then finally, to keep this in mind, to help with that imbalance of power and to help center the care for the community, we need to make sure that the communities we work with have agency in what they do, how they participate, how they want to show up, that they have power in the decision making of how the project moves forward, what it looks like, and that they're treated as equal partners in all things. This is something that historically has not happened and is what part of what we need to change in balancing that power scale and that power dynamic out, where it's not just us as the institution having all the power, it's us sharing power 50-50 with a community that we wish to work with. All right, honing interviewee criteria with the community. So once you've presented some of the project paperwork, the proposal, and assuming that the community agrees and is interested in working with you, the next step is to present a little bit more in depth the research gap analysis and proposed focus, and then the interviewee criteria that you've created from that, and solicit feedback and insight from the community. This is usually an area of tremendous learning opportunity and an area where it's very important to spend some time in so that you do not make mistakes. For example, when you're doing some of that work ahead of time before you approach the community, if you are not a member of that community, it's very easy to not be aware of insider knowledge from the community, things that may have happened previously, areas where there may be particular sensitivity or trauma that needs to be approached very carefully. And this is where you need to rely on the community as experts in their own history and experience to make sure that what you found so far is true and accurate, and then what it is that you need to adjust. And so then working with those community partners, once you have a good set of criteria and focus to move forward, the community partners can help you choose members of their community that would be perhaps open and willing to participate and who would be a good fit for your project. So working with the community is critical here, first of all, just for ethics of care, making sure you're approaching the community and being accurate and non-duplicative, but then also they are the best ones to help point you in the right direction for who to interview and who may be the best subjects for this particular interview project. Next up, we're performing research on each of these potential interviewees, and we're identifying what sort of lived experiences they likely or may have that can help fill in the gaps that we've identified previously in the historical record. And then we're going to work with the community to make sure that the selection of interviewee candidates and contact each of them as joint partners. So once you have that criteria, once you've selected interviewees and have considered how they help fit your focus and could help fill in those gaps, we are next then jointly with our partners reaching out to these potential interviewees to ask if they're interested in participating. And this is another huge area where having the community partnership backing is incredibly helpful, because when you yourself are just trying to essentially cold call potential people in a community to participate in this project, they are understandably going to be very leery and perhaps confused as to why you're contacting them. Whereas when you're contacting them with joint partners and it's clear that this project has been well thought out, then it's a little bit easier to start having those conversations. It's a little bit of a warmer introduction, and you'll be that much more successful in landing interviews with the people and the criteria really that you had hoped to land.